Hey there, fellow night owls and history enthusiasts. Tonight, we're taking a journey back to the windswept fjords and muddy farmsteads of medieval Scandinavia, where your life as a Viking farmer would have been filled with backbreaking labour, occasional glory, and the constant threat of death from causes both heroic and embarrassingly mundane. So before we begin this slow descent into the reality of Norse agricultural life, take a moment to like the video if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into historical tedium, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we collectively procrastinate on sleep. Now, settle in, maybe adjust that pillow, turn on a fan for some white noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because while Hollywood might have you believing that Viking life was all about raiding monasteries and sailing dramatically into the sunset, the truth is that 95% of Norse society spent their days knee-deep in manure, arguing with sheep, and praying that this year's harvest wouldn't leave them eating leather boots by February. So dim the lights, close your eyes, and let's explore what your actual daily existence would have looked like in 9th century Norway, where dreams of Valhalla were often interrupted by the very pressing need to milk the cows before they exploded. Picture this. It's the year 847 CE, and you've just been born into a farming family somewhere along the Norwegian coast. Congratulations, you've entered a world where your life expectancy hovers around 35 if you're lucky, and your most exciting entertainment will be watching your neighbour's roof collapse under the weight of accumulated sheep dung used for insulation. But hey, at least you've got those magnificent fjords to look at while you're slowly dying of malnutrition and intestinal worms. Your father, Thorvald the Perpetually Exhausted, owns about 30 acres of land that would charitably be described as challenging, and more accurately called a cosmic joke played by the gods. Half of it is rock, a quarter is bog that doubles as a convenient place to lose livestock, and the remaining quarter is actual farmable soil that's about as fertile as a monastery floor. But this is your inheritance, your legacy, your ticket to a life of agricultural adventure that will make watching paint dry seem thrilling by comparison. The family homestead is a long house that's part residence, part barn, and entirely aromatic. You share this cozy space with your parents, your 4 siblings, your grandmother who's been alive since the last ice age, 3 cows, a dozen sheep, some chickens that seem determined to commit suicide by various creative methods, and a pig named Bjorn who's smarter than most of your relatives. The walls are made of wood and stone, the roof is turf and sod, and the floors are packed earth mixed with whatever the animals have contributed to the interior design scheme. Your earliest memories involve learning to walk while dodging cow pies and discovering that hay makes an excellent bed as long as you don't mind sharing it with mice, spiders, and the occasional snake. By age 5, you're already contributing to the family economy by collecting eggs, feeding chickens, and developing the crucial Viking skill of determining which mushrooms will feed you and which will send you on a permanent journey to meet Odin ahead of schedule. Education in your household consists primarily of learning how to keep things alive, including yourself. Your father teaches you to read the weather, the soil, and the subtle signs that indicate when your livestock are plotting against you. Your mother instructs you in the ancient arts of food preservation, wool spinning, and the complex social navigation required to survive in a community where everyone knows everyone else's business, including how many times you've relieved yourself behind the barn this week. By age 10, you're operating at the intellectual level of a modern agricultural college graduate, except instead of student loans, you have actual survival depending on your ability to distinguish between healthy grain and ergot-infected death wheat. You can predict weather patterns by observing cloud formations, animal behavior, and the way your grandmother's joints crack in the morning. You know exactly how to preserve meat by smoking, salting, and burying it in the permafrost. And you've mastered the delicate art of making alcohol from whatever organic matter happens to be fermenting in your vicinity. Your days begin before dawn, not because you're particularly ambitious, but because the animals don't care about your sleep schedule and will make their displeasure known through increasingly loud and obnoxious vocalizations. The cows need milking, the sheep need herding to pasture, the chickens need feeding, and the pig needs to be prevented from engineering another escape attempt. Bjorn the pig, you've come to realize, is basically a four-legged Houdini with a superiority complex and an unfortunate tendency to break things. Breakfast, if you can call it that, consists of whatever leftovers from last night's dinner haven't been claimed by the cats, the dog, or the various rodents who consider your home their personal buffet. Usually this means some barley porridge that's been cooking slowly all night. Maybe some preserved fish that tastes like concentrated ocean, and if you're really lucky, some cheese that's only slightly green around the edges. The morning chores are a carefully choreographed dance of inefficiency. You milk the cows while they try to kick you. You collect eggs while the hens attempt to take revenge for their stolen offspring. And you muck out the barn while contemplating whether this is really what your ancestors had in mind when they decided to settle down and embrace agriculture. Spoiler alert, it probably wasn't. Your father spends these early hours checking the fields, examining the crops with the intensity of a modern-day scientist studying cancer cells. Every blade of grain is a potential difference between survival and starvation. Every sign of disease or pest damage, a harbinger of doom that could doom the entire family. He mutters constantly under his breath, usually prayers to Freyr for good harvests mixed with creative curses, directed at whatever gods are responsible for plant diseases, bad weather, and the general unfairness of agricultural life. The spring months are dedicated to the ancient ritual of trying to convince the earth to produce food. Ploughing is done with a wooden plough pulled by whatever animals are strong enough and stupid enough to cooperate. Usually your most stubborn ox, who seems to believe that straight furrows are a violation of his artistic vision. You follow behind, sowing seeds by hand and praying to every deity you can think of that something, anything, will grow. Barley is your main crop, partly because it's relatively hardy and partly because it can be turned into beer, which is basically liquid hope in a world where clean water is rarer than honest merchants. You also grow oats for the horses, rye for bread that will help you understand why your ancestors spent so much time raiding other countries for better food, and various vegetables that will either feed you or poison you, depending on your skill at distinguishing between edible plants and nature's practical jokes. The fields require constant attention. Weeding is a meditation on the fundamental unfairness of existence. For every useful plant you nurture, 10 weeds spring up as if the earth itself is conspiring against your agricultural ambitions. You spend hours hunched over, pulling invasive plants while your back develops the kind of permanent curve that archaeologists will someday use to identify you as a medieval farmer. Stone picking is another beloved activity. Every spring, the freeze-thaw cycle somehow manages to produce a fresh crop of rocks in your fields, as if the earth is trying to give your crops some competition. You collect these stones not because you enjoy manual labor, but because leaving them means your plow will break, your ox will go lame, and your crops will grow around obstacles like a medieval maze designed by someone with a twisted sense of humor. But it's not all agricultural misery. There are moments of genuine satisfaction, like when you see the first green shoots emerging from the soil, or when you successfully prevent the sheep from eating themselves to death on clover, or when you manage to complete an entire day without any animals escaping, dying, or requiring emergency veterinary care that you're not qualified to provide. Your relationship with the weather becomes more intimate than any modern person can imagine. You know the clouds like old friends, reading their shapes and movements with the intensity of a meteorologist with a gambling addiction. A late frost can destroy weeks of work in a single night. Too much rain can rot the crops before they ripen. Too little rain can turn your fields into a monument to agricultural optimism and poor planning. The summer months bring the hay harvest, which sounds pastoral and lovely until you realize it involves cutting grass with hand tools in weather that would make a modern air conditioning repairman weep. You swing a scythe for hours, developing blisters on top of your existing blisters, while the sun beats down like a vengeful deity who's particularly annoyed with farmers. The hay must be cut, dried, turned, and stored before it rots. And weather delays mean the difference between winter feed for your animals and watching them slowly starve while you contemplate which one would taste best in a stew. Haymaking is a community effort, which means all your neighbours show up to help with your harvest in exchange for you helping with theirs. This sounds cooperative and wholesome until you realise it's basically a month-long competition to see who can work themselves closest to death while maintaining the facade of enjoying manual labour. Stories are told, jokes are shared, and everyone pretends not to notice when someone collapses from heat exhaustion or develops a repetitive stress injury that will plague them for the rest of their shortened life. The grain harvest in late summer is the culmination of the entire agricultural year. Everything depends on these few weeks when you race against weather, insects, birds, and time itself to gather the crops that will determine whether your family eats or slowly starves over the coming winter. You cut the grain with sickles, bundle it into sheaves, and haul it to the barn where it will be threshed, winnowed, and stored with all the care usually reserved for precious metals. Threshing involves beating the grain with flails until your arms feel like they're going to fall off, and your brain starts considering whether this is really a more civilized lifestyle than hunting and gathering. Winnowing means throwing the grain into the air and letting the wind separate the good stuff from the chaff, assuming the wind is cooperating and not, say, blowing everything into the next county. But here's where things get interesting, and by interesting, I mean progressively more complicated and potentially deadly. See, your family's agricultural efforts are just the foundation of a complex social and economic system that makes modern bureaucracy look simple by comparison. You're not just a farmer, you're a participant in a feudal network of obligations, loyalties, and potential violence that could drag you away from your peaceful life of agricultural drudgery at any moment. Your father owes service to the local Jarl, a minor noble who owns several farms, and considers himself a big deal despite the fact that his primary qualification for leadership is being better at violence than his neighbours. This service obligation means that when the Jarl decides to go raiding, join a war, or settle a dispute with another Jarl through the time-honoured tradition of armed conflict, your father, and eventually you might be called up to grab a weapon and go play Viking warrior for a few weeks or months. Now, this might sound exciting if you've been watching too many History Channel shows, but the reality is that military service means leaving your farm during crucial agricultural periods to go march around the countryside with a bunch of other farmers who would rather be home taking care of their crops. It's like being drafted into an army where everyone is worried about their livestock and nobody really wants to be there. But social pressure and the threat of being labelled a coward keep everyone participating in this elaborate theatre of medieval masculinity. Your first taste of this comes when you're 15 and your father is called up to join a raid on a neighbouring kingdom. You're left to manage the farm with your mother and younger siblings, which sounds manageable until you realise that everything that can go wrong with agricultural operations will go wrong the moment the person with the most experience is unavailable. The week after your father leaves, the cow gets sick. Not just a little under the weather, but legitimately, dramatically ill in the way that makes you question whether you've angered some minor deity of bovine health. She stops eating, starts producing milk that looks like cottage cheese left in the sun, and develops a cough that sounds like she's trying to hack up her own lungs. You know absolutely nothing about veterinary medicine beyond the folk remedies your grandmother mutters while mixing suspicious-looking potions. But this cow represents a significant portion of your family's wealth and winter food supply. Your mother, bless her practical soul, declares that you need to consult with Astrid the wise woman, who lives 3 farms over and has a reputation for being able to cure anything from sick animals to marital disputes. The hike to Astrid's place involves crossing 2 streams, navigating through a forest where the trees seem personally offended by your presence, and climbing a hill that was apparently designed by someone who hated farmers with a passion. Astrid turns out to be a tiny, ancient woman who smells like herbs, wood smoke, and something that might be dried fish or might be something much worse. She examines your description of the cow's symptoms with the intensity of a modern emergency room doctor, asks detailed questions about the animal's diet, behavior, and recent social interactions. Apparently cows have complex emotional lives, and finally declares that your cow has been cursed by a neighbor who's jealous of your family's relative prosperity. The cure, naturally, involves a complex ritual that requires ingredients you don't have, performed at a time that's inconvenient for everyone involved, with chanting that makes you feel slightly ridiculous. But desperate times call for desperate measures, and if there's even a chance that Astrid's combination of herbal medicine and supernatural intervention can save your cow, you're willing to participate in whatever theatrical production she has in mind. The ritual takes place at midnight during a new moon, because apparently evil spirits have very specific scheduling preferences. You, your mother, and Astrid gather around the sick cow while she performs a ceremony that involves burning herbs, sprinkling mysterious powders, and chanting in a language that might be Old Norse or might be complete gibberish. It's honestly hard to tell the difference when you're sleep deprived and worried about livestock mortality. Whether through Astrid's mystical intervention, the natural course of whatever illness the cow had, or sheer dumb luck, the animal begins to recover over the following days. Her appetite returns, her milk production normalizes, and her cough subsides to merely occasionally threatening rather than constantly alarming. You're not entirely sure what cured her, but you're sufficiently grateful that you don't question the methodology too closely. This experience teaches you several important lessons about Viking Age life. First, everything is more complicated than it appears on the surface. Second, community networks are essential for survival, even when they involve consulting people who may or may not be practicing actual medicine. Third, your success or failure often depends on factors completely beyond your control, whether that's weather, disease, supernatural intervention, or the military ambitions of local nobles who think raiding is a reasonable economic strategy. Your father returns from his military service 2 months later, with stories that range from genuinely heroic to embarrassingly mundane. Yes, there was some fighting. Yes, some treasure was acquired. But mostly, he spent his time marching through forests, setting up camps, dealing with dysentery, and wondering whether the folks back home were managing to keep the farm running without burning anything down or losing all the livestock. The treasure he brings back consists of some silver arm rings, a knife that's slightly better than the one he left with, and a small barrel of mead that tastes like it was made by someone who had heard about honey but never actually seen any. It's enough to cover the farm's tax obligations to the Jarl and maybe purchase some iron tools that will make next year's agricultural work slightly less backbreaking. But it's hardly the kind of wealth that would let your family retire from farming and take up a more leisurely lifestyle. But here's the thing about raiding. It's addictive, not because of the violence or the adventure, but because it offers the tantalizing possibility of escaping the grinding routine of agricultural life. For a few weeks or months, you're not worried about whether the crops will grow or the animals will survive the winter. You're living day to day, eating food that someone else prepared, sleeping in places where you're not responsible for the roof maintenance, and participating in a social dynamic where your value is measured by your courage and loyalty rather than your ability to successfully grow barley. Your father starts talking about the next raiding season with an enthusiasm that's slightly concerning to your mother, who points out that the farm still needs running and that military glory doesn't actually milk the cows or mend the roof. But there's something in his eyes when he talks about the raid. A spark of excitement that's been missing from his daily routine of agricultural maintenance and livestock management. This creates a tension in your family that reflects a larger tension in Viking society, Are you farmers who occasionally go raiding, or are you raiders who happen to farm between military expeditions? The answer varies depending on the year, the success of the harvest, the military opportunities available, and how tired you are of looking at the same cows every morning for the rest of your natural life. As you enter your late teens, this question becomes increasingly personal. Your father is getting older, his back is developing the permanent bend that comes from decades of agricultural labour, and his enthusiasm for military adventures is starting to compete with his enthusiasm for afternoon naps and complaining about the weather. The farm needs a new generation of leadership, but the wider world offers opportunities that farming simply can't match. The neighbouring Jarl, Erika Bloodaxe. Yes, that's really his name. And yes, he thinks it makes him sound intimidating. Starts recruiting for a major expedition to raid the monasteries of Ireland. The potential rewards are significant. Irish monasteries are famously wealthy, poorly defended, and staffed by monks who have taken vows of non-violence that make them ideal targets for people whose vows involve things like death before dishonour and never back down from a fight even when it's obviously a terrible idea. Your father sees this as an opportunity to set the family up financially for the next generation. One successful raid could provide enough wealth to improve the farm, purchase better tools and animals, maybe even buy some land from a neighbour who's tired of trying to grow crops on what appears to be mostly rock with delusions of agricultural potential. But your mother sees it differently. She's lived through enough military expeditions to know that the potential rewards come with very real risks. Men leave for raids and don't come back. They come back injured, traumatized, or fundamentally changed by experiences that have nothing to do with the peaceful routine of family life. And while they're gone, the farms still need to be managed by whoever stays behind. Usually the women and children who somehow have to accomplish all the same work with fewer hands and more worry. The argument that follows is the kind of family discussion that reveals the fundamental tensions in Viking society. Is it better to take risks for the chance of significant rewards, or to focus on the steady, reliable work that keeps families fed and housed year after year? Is military glory worth the very real possibility of leaving your family without a husband and father? Can you afford not to take the opportunities that might lift your family out of the grinding poverty that makes every winter a test of survival skills? Your father eventually decides to join Erika's expedition, partly because of the potential rewards, and partly because refusing would damage his reputation in the community. Reputation in Viking society isn't just about personal pride. It affects everything from your ability to get help during emergencies, to your children's marriage prospects, to your social standing in the complex web of obligations and relationships that keep rural communities functioning. This time, you're old enough to come along. Your father argues that you need to learn the warrior skills that complement farming abilities, that military experience will make you a more complete man, and that the potential rewards justify the risks. Your mother argues that the farm needs you, that military expeditions are an excellent way to get killed for no particularly good reason, and that there are plenty of ways to prove your manhood that don't involve sailing across the North Sea to fight people who have never done anything to you personally. You find yourself caught between competing visions of what your life should be. The farming life offers security, community, and the satisfaction of productive work, but it also offers endless routine, physical hardship, and the constant awareness that you're one bad harvest away from starvation. The raiding life offers adventure, the possibility of wealth, and the social status that comes with military success, but it also offers violence, danger, and the very real possibility of dying far from home for reasons that might not make sense to anyone, except the Jarl who organised the expedition. In the end, you decide to stay home, not because you're afraid of adventure or violence, but because someone needs to take care of the farm and your mother, while your father is gone playing warrior. It's a practical decision that feels like both a sacrifice and a relief. You're giving up the chance for military glory, but you're also avoiding the chance of becoming a casualty in someone else's war. The months while your father is gone prove to be both harder and more satisfying than you expected. Managing the farm solo means working from before dawn to after dusk, dealing with problems that would normally be your father's responsibility, and making decisions that affect your family's survival without having anyone to consult except your mother, who knows everything about running a household, but admits that some aspects of farming are mysteries to her. The summer harvest becomes a community effort in a way you've never experienced before. Your neighbours, understanding that you're managing alone, show up to help with the heavy work without being asked. In return, you help with their harvests, creating a network of mutual support that makes everyone's work easier and more efficient. It's a reminder that Viking society, despite its reputation for violence and individualism, actually depends heavily on cooperation and community solidarity. You also discover that you have a natural talent for agricultural problem solving. When the sheep get loose and start devastating the neighbour's grain field, you devise a containment strategy that becomes a community legend. When a late summer storm threatens to ruin the hay harvest, you organise a lightning-fast community effort that saves not just your hay, but several other families' crops as well. When disease threatens the chickens, you successfully adapt one of Astrid's herbal remedies to create a treatment that saves most of the flock. These may not be the kinds of achievements that get recorded in sagas or remembered by future generations, but they're the kinds of skills that keep communities alive and families fed. You're developing a reputation as someone who can solve problems, manage crises, and organize collective effort skills that are just as valuable as military prowess and considerably more useful in daily life. Your father returns from Ireland in the late fall with stories, scars, and a moderate amount of treasure. The raid was successful in the sense that no one in your family died and some wealth was acquired, but it was also brutal, dangerous, and psychologically exhausting in ways that your father struggles to articulate. He's proud of his military service and grateful for the rewards it brought, but he's also clearly relieved to be back on the farm, where the most dangerous thing he's likely to encounter is an ill-tempered goat. The treasure he brings back is enough to improve the farm significantly. You purchase 2 additional cows, some sheep, better tools, and materials to expand the barn. You also acquire some luxury items that make daily life more pleasant, better cloth for clothing, spices that make preserved food more palatable, and a few pieces of jewelry that increase your family's social status in the community. But the most valuable thing your father brings back isn't material wealth. It's a deeper appreciation for the life you've been living all along. Military expeditions, he explains, involve a lot of sitting around waiting for something to happen, followed by brief periods of intense activity that are usually unpleasant and often terrifying. The food is terrible, the sleeping arrangements are uncomfortable, and you're constantly surrounded by people who are stressed, homesick, and prone to settling disagreements through violence. Farm life, by comparison, offers routine, but routine that's connected to the natural cycles of the seasons and the satisfaction of productive work. It offers community relationships that are based on mutual support rather than military hierarchy. It offers the profound satisfaction of creating something valuable: food, shelter, and security for your family, rather than simply taking wealth that someone else created. Your father's military service also gives him a new perspective on the political dynamics that affect your family's life. The raid on Ireland was successful, but it was also part of a larger pattern of military activity that's making life increasingly dangerous for everyone involved. The Irish are getting better at defending themselves. Other Viking groups are competing for the same targets, and the political situation in Scandinavia is becoming more complex and violent as local jarls compete for power and resources. This broader political context starts to intrude on your peaceful farming life in ways that are both subtle and alarming. The jarl's tax demands increase to fund his military activities. Young men from neighbouring farms are recruited for expeditions and don't come back. The social pressure to participate in military activities increases as raiding becomes more competitive and dangerous. Your family finds itself caught between competing pressures. The farm is more prosperous than it's ever been, thanks to the treasure from your father's raid and your own improvements to agricultural efficiency. But the political environment is becoming more unstable, and neutrality is becoming harder to maintain. The crisis comes when a neighbouring Jarl, Håkon the unreasonably ambitious, decides that your Jarl's territory would make a nice addition to his own holdings. What follows is essentially a local war fought by farmers who would rather be tending their crops, but who find themselves choosing sides in a conflict that has more to do with noble pride than with any actual grievances or territorial disputes. Your family's farm suddenly becomes strategic territory. It's located on a route that both Jarls need to control, and your father's military experience makes him a valuable ally for whichever side he chooses to support. Remaining neutral isn't an option. Both sides make it clear that neutrality will be interpreted as support for their enemies. The choice your family faces is between supporting your traditional Jarl, who has been generally fair but is clearly outmatched militarily, or switching allegiance to Håkon, who is stronger but unknown and possibly more demanding. It's the kind of political decision that could determine your family's fate for generations, and it has to be made based on incomplete information and conflicting loyalties. Your father chooses to remain loyal to your traditional Jarl, partly out of personal honour and partly because he believes that switching sides would damage your family's reputation in the community. It's a principled decision that also happens to be strategically disastrous because Håkon wins the conflict decisively and your family finds itself on the losing side of a local war. The consequences are swift and unforgiving. Your farm is burned, your livestock is scattered or stolen, and your family is left with nothing except the knowledge that honour and principle don't actually provide much protection against the practical realities of political defeat. Your father is killed in the final battle, not heroically in single combat with an enemy champion, but unceremoniously, along with a dozen other farmers who found themselves on the wrong side of someone else's ambition. Your mother, faced with the prospect of trying to rebuild a farm with no resources and no adult male to satisfy the social expectations of property ownership, makes the practical decision to remarry as quickly as possible. Her new husband is Olaf the Pragmatic, a widower with his own farm and children who needs a wife to help manage his household. It's not a romantic match, but it's a survival strategy that ensures everyone involved has shelter, food, and legal protection. You find yourself part of a blended family on an unfamiliar farm, working land that belongs to someone else, and adapting to agricultural techniques that are different from what you learned growing up. It's a humbling experience that forces you to recognize how much of your identity was tied to your family's specific place in the community, and how quickly circumstances can change everything you thought you knew about your life. Olaf turns out to be a decent stepfather and a competent farmer, but his approach to agriculture is more conservative than your father's was. He's less interested in innovation or improvement, and more focused on maintaining steady, reliable production using methods that have worked for generations. This creates some frustration for you, since you've developed ideas about agricultural efficiency that don't fit with his traditional approach. The tension comes to a head during the spring planting season, when you suggest modifications to the crop rotation that could improve yield significantly. Olaf listens politely, but ultimately decides to stick with the established pattern, explaining that farming is risky enough without experimenting with unproven methods. It's a reasonable position that also makes you feel like your knowledge and experience aren't being fully utilized. This is when you start seriously considering the alternatives to farming life that you've been aware of but never actively pursued. Your military experience consists of exactly 0 actual combat, but you have the agricultural background that makes you valuable for supplying and supporting military expeditions. Your understanding of local terrain, weather patterns, and logistics could be useful for leaders who are planning raids or military campaigns. There's also the possibility of becoming a trader, using your knowledge of agricultural production to facilitate commerce between farming communities and the wider world. Vikings weren't just warriors and farmers. They were also merchants, craftsmen, and explorers who established trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. Your understanding of what farming communities need and produce could be the foundation for a commercial career that offers more variety and potentially more wealth than agriculture. The decision to leave farming doesn't come easily. It means abandoning the life you were raised for, disappointing your mother's expectations for your future, and giving up the security and community connections that come with staying in one place. But it also means escaping the grinding routine of agricultural labor, the constant worry about weather and crop diseases, and the political vulnerabilities that come with being tied to a specific piece of land. You make your decision during the winter solstice celebration, when the community gathers to mark the longest night and the promise of returning spring. Looking around at the faces of people you've known your entire life, you realize that you love this community, but you can't spend the rest of your life doing work that someone else could do just as well. You have skills and knowledge that could be useful in a wider world, and staying on the farm would be a waste of your potential and a disservice to your own ambitions. The conversation with your mother is difficult, but not as painful as you expected. She's disappointed that you won't be continuing the family's agricultural tradition, but she also understands that your circumstances are different from what she and your father had planned for you. Your original farm is gone, your father is dead, and your place in the community has changed in ways that make traditional expectations less relevant. Olaf is actually supportive of your decision to leave. He has his own sons to inherit his farm, and having an ambitious stepson around might create complications when it comes time to divide property and responsibilities. He offers to help you get started in whatever career you choose, and he promises to provide a home for your mother, regardless of what you decide to do with your life. The spring of your 21st year becomes a turning point. Instead of planting crops, you're preparing for a life that will take you away from the farming community where you grew up. You spend the season learning new skills, basic combat techniques, trading practices, and the social protocols that govern interactions between communities. Your first opportunity comes when a merchant named Gunnar the Cautiously Optimistic arrives in your community looking for someone to help him transport goods to markets in other regions. He needs an assistant who understands agricultural products, can handle livestock, and won't steal everything he owns the moment they're out of sight of familiar territory. Your reputation for reliability and problem solving makes you an ideal candidate. The work involves traveling between farming communities, purchasing surplus agricultural products when they're abundant and cheap, and transporting them to places where they're scarce and valuable. It's not glamorous. Mostly, you're moving grain, wool, preserved meat, and other bulk commodities that require careful handling and protection from weather, thieves, and spoilage. But it's also education in how the wider world works. You learn about the economic networks that connect Scandinavian farming communities to markets in other countries. You discover that the agricultural techniques you grew up with are just one approach among many, and that different regions have developed different solutions to the same basic problems of food production and storage. You also learn about the political dynamics that affect trade and agriculture on a regional scale. Wars disrupt trade routes and create shortages that can be either opportunities or disasters, depending on which side of the supply chain you're on. Political alliances affect which markets are accessible and which are dangerous. Religious differences create complications when trading with Christian communities that view Norse paganism with suspicion or hostility. Your first major trading expedition takes you through Denmark, into the Frankish territories, and eventually to markets in what would later become Germany. The journey involves river travel, overland transport with ox-drawn carts, and careful navigation of political boundaries that shift depending on the military fortunes of various local rulers. The cultural differences you encounter are both fascinating and occasionally alarming. Some communities have agricultural techniques that are clearly superior to what you grew up with. Others have social customs that make Norse society look like a model of gender equality and personal freedom. The variety of languages, religions, and political systems is overwhelming for someone who grew up in a small farming community where everyone shared the same basic worldview. But the most significant discovery is that your agricultural background gives you advantages in trade that urban merchants don't have. You can evaluate crop quality, estimate storage life, and predict seasonal availability in ways that allow you to make better purchasing decisions and avoid costly mistakes. Your knowledge of farming communities helps you establish trust with producers who are often suspicious of outside traders. The financial rewards of trading are irregular, but potentially substantial. A successful expedition can provide more wealth than several years of farming, but an unsuccessful one can leave you with nothing except experience and debt. The key is developing the knowledge and judgment to minimize risks while maximizing opportunities, and this requires understanding not just the products you're trading, but the people and communities you're working with. Your second year of trading takes you into more ambitious territory. You join an expedition that travels to the British Isles, not for raiding, but for legitimate commerce, with communities that have established trading relationships with Scandinavian merchants. The profits are lower than what raiding might provide, but the risks are also lower, and the relationships you build can provide opportunities for future expeditions. The experience of trading in formerly hostile territory is psychologically complex. Some of the communities you visit have been raided by Vikings in recent years, and the memory of violence affects how you're received even when you're engaged in peaceful commerce. You have to navigate suspicion, fear, and sometimes outright hostility while trying to establish the trust necessary for successful trade relationships. This experience gives you a different perspective on the raiding culture that you grew up with. From the outside, Viking raids aren't adventures or opportunities for glory. They're disasters that destroy communities, kill families, and create economic disruption that lasts for years. The wealth that raiders bring back to Scandinavia is often acquired at the cost of destroying the very communities that could provide sustainable trading opportunities. You start to see a fundamental contradiction in Norse society. The same culture that produces excellent farmers, skilled craftsmen, and successful merchants also glorifies military violence that undermines the economic relationships necessary for long-term prosperity. Raiding may provide short-term wealth, but it also creates enemies, disrupts trade networks, and ultimately makes everyone poorer and less secure. This realization leads you to specialize in trade relationships that offer alternatives to the raiding economy. You develop expertise in luxury goods that can be acquired through peaceful exchange furs from the Northern Territories, amber from the Baltic coast, and crafted items produced by Scandinavian artisans. These products are valuable enough to justify long-distance transport, and they can be acquired without violence or political complications. Your trading career eventually leads you into contact with the broader Viking Age exploration and settlement movement. You participate in expeditions that establish trading posts in Ireland, Scotland, and eventually Iceland. These aren't military conquests, but economic ventures, attempts to create permanent commercial relationships that benefit everyone involved, rather than simply extracting wealth through violence. The Iceland expedition is particularly significant because it represents something entirely new. In your experience, the establishment of a completely new society from scratch. The island is uninhabited except for a few Irish monks who seem to have come there specifically to get away from everyone else, and who greet your arrival with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tax collectors or plague outbreaks. The settlers aren't just farmers looking for new land, though agriculture is certainly part of the plan. They're also craftsmen, traders, and political refugees who see Iceland as an opportunity to create a society that's less constrained by the traditional hierarchies and obligations of Scandinavian communities. It's an experiment in social organization that appeals to your own sense that there might be better ways to live than the ones you grew up with. Your role in the Iceland settlement is to help establish the agricultural foundation that will make permanent settlement possible. This means not just farming, but creating the entire infrastructure of food production, storage, and distribution that a new community needs to survive. It's like building a farming operation from scratch, except you're also building the community, the economy, and the political system at the same time. The challenges are immense and often bizarre. The climate is different from what you're used to. The soil behaves in unexpected ways, and the local wildlife includes species that don't exist in Scandinavia. You have to experiment with crop varieties, adapt livestock management techniques, and develop entirely new approaches to problems you thought you'd already solved. But there's also a profound satisfaction in creating something entirely new. Every field you clear, every building you construct, every problem you solve is contributing to the establishment of a permanent human presence in a place that was previously wilderness. You're not just farming, you're participating in the creation of a new civilization. The social dynamics of the settlement are equally challenging and rewarding. Without established hierarchies and traditional obligations, the community has to develop new ways of making collective decisions, resolving disputes, and organizing cooperative work. Your experience with agricultural cooperation and community organization makes you a valuable participant in these discussions. The famous Icelandic Althing, the assembly where free men gather to make laws and settle disputes, develops partly from your community's need to establish rules for land ownership, resource allocation, and conflict resolution. It's democracy of a sort, though a democracy limited to property-owning men who can afford to travel to the assembly site and spend time debating legal principles instead of working their farms. Your participation in these early legislative sessions gives you insight into the political philosophy that's developing in this new society. The Icelandic settlers are trying to create a system that preserves individual freedom while maintaining the social cooperation necessary for survival. It's a balance that requires constant negotiation and adjustment, and it doesn't always work smoothly. The agricultural challenges of Iceland force you to develop new expertise in crop selection, soil management, and livestock breeding. The growing season is shorter than what you're used to, the weather is more unpredictable, and the soil quality varies dramatically from one location to another. Success requires not just hard work, but careful observation, systematic experimentation, and the ability to adapt quickly when your initial assumptions prove wrong. You also discover that Iceland offers opportunities for economic activities that aren't available in more densely populated regions. The island's location makes it a natural stopping point for ships traveling between Scandinavia and other North Atlantic destinations. The abundant fish stocks provide opportunities for commercial fishing that complement agricultural production. The unique geological features create possibilities for extracting minerals and other resources that are valuable in trade. But perhaps most importantly, Iceland offers something that you've been seeking without fully realizing it: the opportunity to live a life that's defined by your own choices, rather than by inherited obligations and traditional expectations. In this new society, your social status depends more on your contributions to the community and your personal achievements than on your family background or your relationship to established power structures. This freedom comes with corresponding responsibilities. In a traditional farming community, your role and obligations are largely predetermined by social custom and family tradition. In Iceland, you have to create your own role, define your own obligations, and take responsibility for the consequences of your decisions in ways that are both liberating and terrifying. The physical demands of life in Iceland are, if anything, more challenging than what you experienced as a farmer in Norway. The climate is harsher, the agricultural work is more difficult, and the isolation means that mistakes or accidents can have more serious consequences. But the psychological experience is entirely different. Instead of enduring hardship as an unavoidable aspect of your predetermined social role, you're choosing to accept challenges as part of building something new and valuable. Your first winter in Iceland is a test of both your practical skills and your psychological resilience. The darkness lasts longer than you're prepared for, the cold is more intense than you expected, and the isolation from the broader world is more complete than you've ever experienced. The community survives, but just barely, and several families decide to return to Scandinavia rather than endure another season in what they describe as a frozen wasteland with delusions of grandeur. But you stay, partly because leaving would feel like admitting defeat, and partly because you've begun to see possibilities in Iceland that aren't available anywhere else. The island's isolation protects it from the political conflicts that are making life increasingly dangerous in Scandinavia. The abundant natural resources provide opportunities for economic development that could eventually make the community quite prosperous. And the social experiment of creating a new kind of society is proving to be both fascinating and surprisingly successful. Your second year in Iceland brings improvements in both agricultural techniques and community organization. You've adapted your farming methods to local conditions, established productive relationships with neighboring settlements, and developed new sources of income that complement agricultural production. The community is becoming more stable, more prosperous, and more confident about its long-term prospects. But this success also brings new challenges. As word of Iceland's potential spreads, more settlers arrive from Scandinavia, and not all of them share the cooperative spirit and experimental attitude of the original colonists. Some of the newcomers are political refugees fleeing conflicts at home, and they bring with them the same attitudes and rivalries that made those conflicts necessary in the first place. The community starts experiencing internal tensions that mirror the political problems of the homeland you thought you'd left behind. Disputes over land allocation, resource access, and social status begin to create factions within the settlement. The informal cooperation that worked when everyone was focused on basic survival becomes more difficult when people have time and energy to pursue individual ambitions. Your own position in this developing conflict is complicated by your success as both a farmer and a community organizer. Some people see you as a natural leader whose experience and judgment should guide community decisions. Others view you as an ambitious outsider who's trying to gain power and influence at their expense. The consensus-based decision-making that worked in the early days becomes more difficult as the community grows larger and more diverse. The crisis comes during your third year, when a dispute over grazing rights escalates into something approaching civil conflict. Two families claim the same pasture land. Both sides have legitimate arguments based on different interpretations of the community's informal land allocation agreements, and the dispute has expanded to include questions about legal procedures, political authority, and the fundamental principles that should govern the community. Your attempt to mediate the dispute satisfies no one and leaves you politically isolated from both factions. The family that loses the immediate disagreement blames you for supporting their opponents. The family that wins suspects that your mediation was influenced by personal relationships rather than objective judgment. The community as a whole loses confidence in informal conflict resolution and begins demanding more formal legal structures. This experience teaches you several important lessons about the challenges of creating new societies. Good intentions and shared hardships aren't sufficient to prevent political conflicts. Individual success can create social tensions even in communities that supposedly value cooperation. And the isolation that protects a community from external threats can also intensify internal conflicts by making it impossible for dissatisfied people to simply leave and start over somewhere else. The resolution of the land dispute eventually leads to the establishment of more formal legal procedures and political structures. The community adopts written laws, creates official positions for resolving disputes, and establishes mechanisms for making collective decisions that don't depend on unanimous consent. It's a more sophisticated system than what existed before, but it's also more hierarchical and less egalitarian. Your role in this new system is limited by the political damage you suffered during the mediation attempt. You're still respected for your agricultural expertise and your contributions to the community's economic development, but you're no longer seen as a potential leader or political decision-maker. It's a humbling experience that forces you to reconsider your ambitions and your understanding of your own capabilities. The lesson isn't that you're not capable of leadership, but that leadership in political situations requires different skills than leadership in agricultural or economic contexts. Managing crops and livestock involves working with natural systems that follow predictable patterns. Managing human communities involves working with social and psychological dynamics that are much more complex and unpredictable. You decide to focus on what you do best, agricultural innovation and economic development, while leaving political leadership to people who have more talent for managing human conflicts and competing ambitions. It's a practical decision that also happens to be personally satisfying, since you find agricultural problem-solving more interesting than political maneuvering. Your specialized expertise in Icelandic agriculture eventually makes you a valuable consultant for new settlements throughout the North Atlantic region. You participate in expeditions that establish farming communities in the Faroe Islands, Greenland, and eventually the coast of North America. Each new location presents unique challenges that require adapting your agricultural knowledge to different climates, soils, and environmental conditions. The Greenland expedition is particularly challenging because the name turns out to be wildly misleading marketing rather than accurate geographical description. The island is mostly ice. The climate is brutal even by Icelandic standards, and the agricultural possibilities are limited to small coastal areas where the growing season is measured in weeks rather than months. But the challenges also force you to develop new techniques for food production and storage that push the boundaries of what's possible in extreme environments. Your work in Greenland involves developing systems for preserving and storing food that can sustain a community through 9-month winters when fresh food production is impossible. You experiment with fermentation techniques, smoking and drying methods, and storage systems that can protect food from freezing, moisture, and spoilage for extended periods. These innovations eventually prove useful in other locations where seasonal food scarcity is a problem. The psychological challenges of life in Greenland are as demanding as the physical ones. The extreme isolation, harsh climate, and constant awareness that survival depends on perfect execution of complex logistics creates stress levels that strain even the most stable personalities. Several colonists develop what would now be recognized as seasonal affective disorder, depression, or anxiety disorders, but which at the time are attributed to supernatural influences or moral failings. Your experience with community organization becomes crucial for maintaining social cohesion under these extreme conditions. You help establish routines, recreational activities, and social rituals that provide psychological support during the darkest months of the year. The community's survival depends not just on having enough food and fuel, but on maintaining the social bonds and shared purpose that keep people working together when individual survival would be easier to achieve alone. The Greenland settlement ultimately fails, not because of agricultural or technical problems, but because of climate change that makes an already marginal environment completely unsuitable for European-style agriculture. The medieval warm period that made settlement possible in the first place comes to an end. Temperatures drop significantly, and the community's food production systems can no longer support the population. The evacuation of Greenland is a profound personal failure for you, despite the fact that the environmental changes that caused it were completely beyond your control. You've invested years of work in developing agricultural systems that were successful within their limitations, and watching them become obsolete due to climatic changes feels like a repudiation of everything you've learned about farming and community development. But the failure also provides valuable perspective on the relationship between human ambition and environmental constraints. All of your agricultural innovations, all of your community organizing skills, and all of your accumulated expertise couldn't overcome the basic fact that some environments are too hostile to support permanent human settlement using available technology. It's a humbling reminder that human ingenuity has limits, and that survival often depends more on adapting to environmental conditions than on trying to overcome them. Your return to Iceland after the Greenland evacuation marks the beginning of a new phase in your life. You're now in your 40s, experienced in agricultural techniques that work in extreme environments, and knowledgeable about the social dynamics of small communities under stress. But you're also tired of pioneering, tired of constantly adapting to new challenges, and increasingly interested in applying your expertise in more stable circumstances. The Iceland you return to has changed significantly during your absence. The original experimental community has evolved into a more conventional society with established institutions, social hierarchies, and economic systems. The island now supports a population large enough to sustain specialized crafts, regular trade relationships, and cultural activities that go beyond basic survival. It's no longer a frontier society, but it's still sufficiently different from traditional Scandinavian communities to offer opportunities for innovation and independence. You establish yourself as a specialist in agricultural consultation and community planning. Your reputation for solving problems in extreme environments makes you valuable to new settlements throughout the North Atlantic region, and your experience with failed communities helps you identify potential problems before they become serious crises. It's work that allows you to use all of your accumulated expertise while avoiding the personal and emotional costs of permanent involvement in experimental communities. The consulting work also gives you opportunities to see how different communities have adapted to similar challenges using different approaches. Some settlements have emphasized military organization and hierarchical leadership. Others have focused on economic specialization and trade relationships. Still others have prioritized social cooperation and consensus-based decision-making. Each approach has advantages and disadvantages, and success often depends more on how well the approach fits the specific circumstances than on which approach is inherently superior. Your observations of these different community models gradually lead you to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual choice and social organization. The freedom to choose your own life path, which was one of the attractions of emigrating to Iceland, exists within social and economic constraints that limit the available options. Individual success depends partly on personal skills and efforts, but also on community institutions, environmental conditions, and historical circumstances that are largely beyond individual control. This understanding leads you to a more modest assessment of your own achievements and a more realistic view of what individual effort can accomplish. You've been successful as a farmer, trader, and consultant, but your success has depended on favorable circumstances, supportive communities, and opportunities that were available to you, but not to everyone else. Recognizing these dependencies doesn't diminish the value of your achievements, but it does place them in a broader context. As you enter your 50s, you begin experiencing the physical decline that affects everyone who survives to middle age in a society without modern medical care. Your back aches from decades of agricultural labor. Your joints are stiff from years of exposure to harsh weather, and your eyesight is starting to deteriorate in ways that make detailed work more difficult. These changes force you to rely more on your intellectual and social skills and less on your physical capabilities. The transition from physical to intellectual labor is easier for you than it might be for someone else, since your consulting work already emphasized problem solving and community organization rather than manual labor. But the reminder of your own mortality also encourages you to think about what you want to accomplish with whatever time you have left, and how you want to be remembered by the communities you've been part of. You decide to document your agricultural innovations and community organizing techniques in written form, creating a manual that could be useful for future settlers and community leaders. This is an unusual project for someone of your background, since literacy is still relatively uncommon among farmers and craftsmen. But your trading career required you to develop reading and writing skills that make the project feasible. The process of writing down what you've learned forces you to think systematically about the principles underlying your practical techniques. Why do certain agricultural methods work better in extreme climates? What social structures are most effective for maintaining cooperation under stress? How can communities balance individual freedom with collective needs? These questions have practical importance for future settlers, but they also have philosophical implications that go beyond immediate survival concerns. Your agricultural manual becomes one of the first systematic treatises on farming techniques adapted to North Atlantic conditions. It covers crop selection, soil management, livestock breeding, food preservation, and storage systems, but it also addresses the social and economic factors that affect agricultural success. The manual emphasizes the importance of community cooperation, the need for flexibility and adaptation, and the recognition that agricultural techniques must be adapted to local conditions rather than applied universally. The community organizing sections of your manual focus on the challenges of establishing and maintaining social cooperation in small, isolated communities. You discuss leadership techniques, conflict resolution methods, and decision-making procedures that you've seen work successfully in various circumstances. You also analyze the failures you've witnessed, trying to identify the factors that lead to community breakdown and the warning signs that indicate when intervention might be necessary. The writing project takes several years to complete, partly because you're still doing consulting work, and partly because you want to be thorough and accurate. You interview other settlers about their experiences, test your recommendations against the practices of successful communities, and revise your conclusions based on new information and changing circumstances. The finished manual becomes a valuable resource for new settlements throughout the Nordic Atlantic region. It's copied and distributed to other communities, translated into different languages, and adapted for use in various environments. Your reputation as an agricultural expert is enhanced by the manual's success, and you receive requests for consultation from communities as far away as the Orkney Islands and the coast of Scotland. But the manual's success also marks the end of your active career as a pioneer and innovator. You've documented what you've learned, passed on your expertise to the next generation, and established yourself as an authority on agricultural and social techniques for extreme environments. There's satisfaction in this achievement, but there's also a sense that your most creative and adventurous period is coming to an end. Your later years are spent as an elder advisor in the Icelandic community where you've established permanent residence. Your role involves helping younger farmers solve agricultural problems, advising community leaders on social issues, and serving as a repository of historical knowledge about the early settlement period. It's a respected position that provides security and social status, but it also represents acceptance that your days of pioneering new territories and experimenting with social innovations are over. The physical decline that began in your 50s accelerates in your 60s. Your hands are too stiff to handle detailed agricultural work. Your back is too weak for heavy labor, and your eyesight is too poor for precise tasks. But your intellectual capabilities remain strong, and your accumulated knowledge makes you valuable as a teacher and advisor, even when you can no longer perform physical work. The teaching role gives you an opportunity to influence the next generation of farmers and community leaders, passing on not just technical knowledge, but also the broader perspective you've gained from decades of experience in different environments and communities. Your students include your own children and grandchildren, but also young people from throughout the region who come to learn from someone who participated in the founding of multiple communities. You find that teaching forces you to continue learning as your students ask questions that challenge your assumptions and require you to think about familiar problems from new perspectives. The interaction with younger people also keeps you connected to developments in agricultural techniques, community organization, and social innovation that you might otherwise miss as you become more isolated by age and infirmity. Your final years are marked by the gradual loss of physical capabilities that ultimately makes independent living impossible. You move in with one of your sons, becoming dependent on family care in the same way that your own parents depended on you during their final years. It's a humbling experience that completes the cycle of dependency and responsibility that characterizes family life in societies without institutional support for elderly care. But even in physical decline, you maintain your intellectual engagement with the communities you've been part of. You continue to advise on agricultural problems, though now through family members who serve as intermediaries. You dictate updates and revisions to your agricultural manual as new techniques are developed and tested. You share stories and historical perspective with anyone who's interested in learning about the early settlement period and the challenges that the first generations of colonists faced. Your death, when it comes, is as unremarkable as most deaths in medieval society, a gradual weakening followed by illness that proves beyond the capability of available medical treatment. You die in your bed, surrounded by family members, with the satisfaction of knowing that your life's work has contributed to the establishment of permanent human communities in places that were previously uninhabited wilderness. There's no saga written about your life, no dramatic stories about heroic deeds or legendary achievements. Your legacy consists of agricultural techniques that continue to feed communities throughout the North Atlantic region, community organizing principles that helped settlements maintain social cooperation, and written documentation that preserves knowledge for future generations. It's not the kind of fame that gets remembered in epic poetry, but it's the kind of practical contribution that makes civilization possible. In the end, your life as a Viking Age farmer, trader, and settler represents one possible path through a historical period that offered both extraordinary opportunities and extraordinary dangers. You chose adaptation over conquest, cooperation over conflict, and innovation over tradition. These choices led to a life that was challenging but satisfying, difficult but meaningful, and ultimately successful by the standards of someone who measured achievement in terms of survival, community building, and the creation of sustainable human settlements in challenging environments. The agricultural manual you wrote survives in various copies and adaptations, becoming one of the foundational texts for North Atlantic settlement communities. Your agricultural innovations continue to influence farming practices centuries after your death. The communities you helped establish continue to thrive, supporting populations that eventually grow into the modern nations of Iceland, the Faroe Islands, and other North Atlantic territories. But perhaps, most importantly, your life demonstrates that the Viking Age offered alternatives to the raiding and conquest that dominate popular historical narratives. For every warrior seeking glory in battle, there were dozens of farmers, traders, and settlers who built the economic and social foundations that made Viking civilization possible. Your story is the story of these ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things, not through violence and conquest, but through hard work, adaptation, and the patient construction of human communities in places where none had existed before. The irony of your legacy becomes clear as the decades pass after your death. While the sagas celebrate warriors who burned monasteries and conquered kingdoms, your agricultural manual becomes one of the most copied and valued texts in the medieval North Atlantic world. Monks in Irish scriptoriums, the very people whose ancestors fled Viking raids, carefully transcribe your farming techniques because they recognize that survival trumps historical grievances when winter is coming and the barley crop has failed. Your innovations in crop rotation, developed through trial and error on the marginal soils of Iceland, eventually spread throughout Northern Europe. The three-field system you helped refine becomes standard practice in regions where farmers previously struggled with soil exhaustion and declining yields. Your techniques for preserving food through the long Arctic winters save countless communities from starvation, though none of them know the name of the farmer who first figured out the optimal fermentation process for fish that won't kill you. But perhaps the most significant aspect of your legacy isn't technical, but social. The community organizing principles you develop for managing disputes in isolated settlements become the foundation for legal systems that prioritize consensus and compensation over violence and revenge. The Icelandic Althing, which you helped establish and participated in during its early years, evolves into one of the world's first parliamentary systems, influencing democratic development throughout Northern Europe. Your descendants scatter across the North Atlantic world, carrying with them not just your genetic material, but your approaches to problem solving, community building, and adaptation to challenging environments. Some become successful farmers in their own right, applying your techniques to new territories and environmental conditions. Others become traders, craftsmen, or political leaders, but they carry with them the fundamental values you embodied: the importance of practical knowledge, the necessity of community cooperation, and the recognition that survival often depends more on adaptation than on conquest. The communities you helped establish grow and evolve in ways you never could have anticipated. Iceland develops into a unique society that combines democratic governance with literary achievement, producing some of the greatest works of medieval European literature, while maintaining the agricultural and economic foundations you helped create. The Faroe Islands become a crucial way station for North Atlantic navigation and trade. Even the failed Greenland settlement contributes to geographical knowledge that eventually enables later exploration and mapping of the Arctic regions. Your agricultural manual undergoes numerous revisions and updates as subsequent generations of farmers encounter new challenges and develop new solutions. The basic principles you established, careful observation of local conditions, systematic experimentation with new techniques, and adaptation of traditional methods to unusual environments, become standard practice for agricultural innovation throughout the medieval period. The manual's influence extends beyond agriculture into other areas of practical knowledge. Your systematic approach to documenting and testing techniques influences the development of craftwork, construction, and even early medical practice. The idea that practical knowledge should be recorded, shared, and continuously improved becomes a foundational principle for technological development in medieval society. But the manual also preserves something less tangible but equally valuable: a record of what daily life was actually like for ordinary people during the Viking Age. While the sagas focus on kings and warriors, your writing documents the experiences of farmers, traders, and settlers who made up the vast majority of the population. Future historians rely on your descriptions of agricultural techniques, community organization, and social relationships to understand how medieval Scandinavian society actually functioned. The psychological insights embedded in your community organizing techniques prove to be remarkably durable. Your observations about the importance of maintaining morale during long winter periods influence the development of seasonal celebrations and social rituals throughout Northern Europe. Your analysis of leadership techniques and conflict resolution methods becomes part of the informal knowledge base that community leaders draw upon for centuries. Your understanding of the relationship between individual ambition and community needs anticipates many of the political and social challenges that arise as medieval societies become more complex and hierarchical. The balance you helped establish between personal freedom and collective responsibility becomes a model for political development that influences the evolution of democratic institutions throughout the Nordic world. The trading networks you helped establish evolve into some of the most important commercial relationships in medieval Europe. The routes you pioneered for moving agricultural products between different regions become the foundation for trade relationships that connect Scandinavia to markets throughout the known world. Your innovations in logistics and transportation influence the development of commercial practices that make long-distance trade safer and more profitable. Your recognition that successful trade depends on establishing trust and mutual benefit rather than exploitation becomes a fundamental principle for commercial relationships throughout the North Atlantic region. The trading partnerships you establish between farming communities and urban markets create economic opportunities that help stabilize settlement populations and reduce the economic pressures that often drove communities toward raiding and warfare. The environmental knowledge you accumulated through decades of farming in extreme conditions becomes crucial for understanding climate change and adaptation strategies. Your detailed observations of weather patterns, growing seasons, and crop performance provide some of the earliest systematic data about environmental conditions in the North Atlantic region during the medieval warm period. When climate change eventually makes some of your settlements unsustainable, the adaptation strategies you developed help communities relocate and reorganize rather than simply collapse. The flexibility and resilience you built into agricultural and social systems enable many communities to survive environmental changes that might otherwise have been catastrophic. Your approach to documenting and sharing knowledge influences the development of educational practices throughout medieval Scandinavia. The idea that practical expertise should be systematically recorded and transmitted to future generations becomes a foundational principle for technical education. Your manual becomes a model for other instructional texts that help preserve and transmit crucial knowledge about crafts, agriculture, and community organization. The teaching methods you developed for training young farmers and community leaders influence pedagogical approaches throughout the region. Your emphasis on hands-on experience combined with systematic understanding of underlying principles becomes standard practice for technical education in fields ranging from shipbuilding to metalworking. Your recognition that education must be adapted to local conditions and specific community needs influences the development of educational institutions that serve rural populations. The practical focus of your teaching approach becomes a model for educational programs that prepare people for the actual challenges they'll face in their working lives, rather than abstract theoretical knowledge. The social innovations you helped develop in Iceland eventually influence political development throughout Scandinavia. The democratic procedures and legal systems you helped establish become models for political reform in societies that had previously relied on autocratic leadership and traditional authority structures. Your insights about the importance of institutional flexibility and adaptation influence the development of political systems that can respond to changing circumstances without completely breaking down. The balance you helped establish between formal legal procedures and informal community cooperation becomes a model for political development that combines stability with responsiveness. The conflict resolution techniques you develop for managing disputes in small communities eventually influence legal systems throughout Northern Europe. Your emphasis on compensation and restoration, rather than punishment and revenge, becomes a fundamental principle for legal systems that prioritize community harmony over individual retribution. Your understanding of the psychological and social factors that contribute to community stability influences the development of social institutions that support collective cooperation. The recreational activities, seasonal celebrations, and community rituals you helped establish become models for social programs that maintain community cohesion under stress. Your recognition that successful communities require both individual achievement and collective cooperation influences social policy development throughout the medieval period. The balance you helped establish between personal ambition and community responsibility becomes a model for social organization that enables both individual success and collective prosperity. The agricultural techniques you develop for extreme environments eventually influence farming practices far beyond the North Atlantic region. Your innovations in crop selection, soil management, and food preservation spread through trade networks and migration patterns to influence agricultural development throughout Northern Europe. Your systematic approach to agricultural experimentation influences the development of scientific agriculture throughout the medieval period. The idea that farming techniques should be systematically tested and refined rather than simply inherited from previous generations becomes a foundational principle for agricultural innovation. Your recognition that agricultural success depends on understanding and adapting to local environmental conditions influences the development of ecological approaches to farming that recognize the importance of working with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them. The economic principles you develop for balancing agricultural production with trade relationships influence the development of market systems throughout the medieval period. Your understanding of supply and demand, seasonal price variations, and the importance of reliable transportation influences commercial practices that make trade safer and more profitable. Your innovations in food preservation and storage influence the development of urban food supply systems that enable the growth of larger population centers. The techniques you develop for maintaining food quality during long-term storage become crucial for feeding populations that are no longer directly involved in agricultural production. Your understanding of the relationship between agricultural productivity and population growth influences demographic development throughout the North Atlantic region. The increased food security made possible by your agricultural innovations enables population growth that supports the development of more complex social and economic institutions. The ripple effects of your work extend far beyond what any single farmer could have imagined. In the monasteries of Ireland, scribes who once fled Viking raids now carefully copy your techniques for winter food preservation, recognizing that survival transcends historical grievances. When faced with crop failures and famine, your methods for smoking fish and fermenting vegetables become standard practice in communities that have never heard your name but depend daily on innovations you developed while trying to keep your family fed through another brutal Icelandic winter. The psychological techniques you developed for maintaining community morale during the darkest months proved to be remarkably sophisticated by modern standards. Your understanding that seasonal depression could be combated through structured social activities, shared storytelling sessions, and carefully planned celebrations becomes a model for community mental health practices that won't be formally recognized by medicine for another 1,000 years. Your observations about the relationship between diet and health, recorded in the margins of your agricultural manual, influence medical practices throughout Northern Europe. Your discovery that certain preserved foods could prevent scurvy during long sea voyages becomes crucial knowledge for the merchants and explorers who follow in your wake. The detailed notes you kept about which plants seem to improve health and which caused illness become part of the informal pharmaceutical knowledge that keeps medieval communities functioning. The architectural innovations you develop for farm buildings in extreme climates influence construction practices throughout the Arctic regions. Your designs for barns that could withstand hurricane-force winds while maintaining proper ventilation for livestock become standard throughout the North Atlantic. Your techniques for insulating buildings using locally available materials, turf, stone, and carefully arranged timber enable permanent settlement in regions that were previously considered uninhabitable. Your innovations in water management proved to be particularly influential. The systems you developed for collecting, storing, and purifying water in communities where reliable freshwater sources were scarce become models for settlement planning throughout the medieval period. Your understanding of how to maintain water quality during long storage periods prevents countless outbreaks of waterborne disease in communities that follow your guidelines. The textile innovations you developed, working alongside the women of your household to create clothing suitable for extreme weather conditions, influence clothing design throughout Northern Europe. Your adaptations of traditional Scandinavian garments for Arctic conditions, the layering systems, the strategic use of fur and wool, the designs that provided maximum warmth while allowing for physical labor becomes standard for anyone working or traveling in cold climates. Your experimentation with different methods of heating buildings leads to architectural innovations that improve both comfort and fuel efficiency. The heating systems you develop, using carefully designed fireplaces and innovative approaches to heat distribution, enable communities to maintain habitable temperatures while conserving scarce fuel resources. These innovations prove crucial for settlements in regions where firewood is limited, and every calorie of fuel must be used efficiently. The tool innovations you develop, adapting traditional Scandinavian implements for use in different soil types and climatic conditions, influence agricultural development throughout the region. Your modifications to plough designs, your innovations in harvesting tools, and your improvements to food processing equipment become standard throughout communities facing similar environmental challenges. Your understanding of animal husbandry in extreme climates proves to be revolutionary. The breeding programs you develop, selecting for animals that can survive harsh winters while maintaining productivity, create livestock strains that enable agriculture in regions where traditional farming would be impossible. Your innovations in animal shelter design, feeding strategies, and health management become models for livestock management throughout the Arctic regions. The seasonal planning techniques you develop, coordinating agricultural activities with weather patterns and community needs, influence time management practices throughout medieval society. Your systematic approach to scheduling work, balancing immediate needs with long-term planning, becomes a model for organizational efficiency that influences everything from military campaigns to construction projects. Your innovations in food storage extend beyond simple preservation to include sophisticated inventory management systems. Your methods for tracking food supplies, rotating stocks, and predicting consumption needs become models for logistics management that influence military supply systems, merchant operations, and community planning throughout the medieval period. The conflict resolution techniques you develop for managing disputes in isolated communities prove to be remarkably sophisticated. Your understanding that successful mediation requires addressing underlying psychological and social needs, not just immediate grievances, influences legal development throughout Northern Europe. Your approaches to restorative justice, emphasizing community healing over individual punishment, become models for legal systems that prioritize social harmony. Your recognition that successful leadership requires different skills in different contexts influences leadership development throughout medieval society. Your observation that the qualities that make someone an effective agricultural manager may be different from those needed for military leadership or trade negotiations becomes part of the informal wisdom that guides leadership selection and training. The educational innovations you develop for training young people in practical skills influence pedagogical development throughout the region. Your systematic approach to teaching, combining theoretical understanding with hands-on experience, adapting instruction to individual learning styles, and emphasizing problem-solving over rote memorization, becomes a model for educational practices that remain influential centuries later. Your understanding of the psychological factors that contribute to successful community cooperation influences social policy development throughout the medieval period. Your observations about the importance of maintaining individual dignity while requiring collective contribution become part of the theoretical foundation for political systems that balance personal freedom with community responsibility. The environmental monitoring techniques you develop, tracking weather patterns, soil conditions, and ecosystem health, influence early scientific development throughout Northern Europe. Your systematic approach to environmental observation, recording changes and patterns over multiple years, becomes a model for empirical research that contributes to the development of scientific methodology. Your innovations in transportation and logistics, developed to move agricultural products between different regions, influence commercial development throughout the North Atlantic. Your understanding of how to preserve product quality during long-distance transport your innovations in packaging and handling, and your development of efficient route planning become part of the commercial knowledge that enables long-distance trade. The community planning techniques you develop, balancing individual family needs with collective resource requirements, influence urban development throughout the medieval period. Your approaches to land use planning, resource allocation, and infrastructure development become models for settlement design that remain influential as communities grow larger and more complex. Your recognition that successful communities require both formal institutions and informal social networks influences social organization throughout Northern Europe. Your understanding of how to maintain community cohesion while accommodating individual differences becomes part of the social wisdom that enables diverse populations to live together peacefully. The crisis management techniques you develop for helping communities survive emergencies influence disaster preparedness throughout the medieval period. Your systematic approaches to emergency planning, resource conservation, and community coordination become models for crisis response that save countless lives during famines, epidemics, and military conflicts. Your innovations in communication systems, developed to maintain contact between isolated settlements, influence information management throughout the region. Your techniques for preserving and transmitting important information, your development of reliable message systems, and your understanding of how to maintain accurate communication over long distances become part of the infrastructure that enables complex political and economic systems. But perhaps most significantly, your life demonstrates something that's often lost in historical narratives, focused on dramatic events and famous personalities: the profound importance of ordinary competence in extraordinary circumstances. Your achievements aren't the stuff of epic poetry, but they're the foundation that makes epic poetry possible. Someone has to grow the food that feeds the poets, build the houses that shelter the storytellers, and create the social institutions that enable communities to survive long enough to develop culture and art. Your systematic approach to problem-solving, observing carefully, experimenting systematically, documenting results, and sharing knowledge becomes part of the intellectual foundation for scientific and technological development that eventually transforms human civilization. The habits of mind you develop through decades of agricultural work influence approaches to knowledge development that remain relevant in fields far removed from farming. Your understanding that individual success depends on community cooperation becomes part of the social wisdom that enables human societies to function effectively. Your recognition that personal achievement and collective responsibility aren't competing values, but complementary necessities influences social and political development throughout the medieval period and beyond. Your approach to leadership, leading by example, sharing knowledge freely, and maintaining focus on practical results rather than personal glory, becomes a model for effective leadership that influences management practices throughout history. Your demonstration that authority based on competence and service is more durable than authority based on force or inheritance becomes part of the foundation for democratic political development. Your life also demonstrates the importance of adaptability and resilience in human development. Your ability to adapt to changing circumstances, learn from failures, and maintain productivity under stress becomes a model for individual and community development that remains relevant as human societies face increasingly complex challenges. The balance you achieve between innovation and tradition, respecting accumulated wisdom while remaining open to new approaches, becomes a model for cultural development that enables societies to evolve without losing their foundational values. Your recognition that change must be carefully managed to avoid destroying the social bonds that hold communities together influences political and social policy development throughout history. Your demonstration that meaningful work doesn't require dramatic achievements or public recognition becomes part of the cultural foundation for human dignity and purpose. Your life shows that the satisfaction of contributing to human welfare through competent, dedicated work is available to anyone willing to accept responsibility and develop their capabilities. The environmental wisdom you develop through decades of working with natural systems becomes increasingly relevant as human societies face environmental challenges that require fundamental changes in human behavior. Your understanding that long-term prosperity depends on working with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them anticipates ecological approaches that won't be formally recognized for centuries. The community organizing techniques you develop for managing isolated settlements influence the development of administrative systems that govern larger territories. Your approaches to collective decision-making, resource allocation, and conflict resolution become models for political administration that can manage diverse populations and competing interests. Your recognition that effective leadership requires understanding both technical expertise and human psychology influences the development of leadership training throughout medieval society. The leadership techniques you develop for managing agricultural communities become models for leadership development in other fields. Your emphasis on the importance of maintaining community morale and cooperation influences the development of social policies that support collective action under stress. The community support systems you helped establish become models for social institutions that help populations survive economic, environmental, and political challenges. The documentation practices you establish for recording and transmitting practical knowledge influence the development of technical literature throughout the medieval period. Your systematic approach to describing agricultural techniques becomes a model for instructional writing that helps preserve and transmit crucial technical knowledge. Your recognition that knowledge must be continuously updated and refined influences the development of intellectual traditions that emphasize empirical observation and systematic experimentation. The scientific approach you applied to agricultural problem solving becomes a model for knowledge development in other fields. Your understanding of the importance of sharing knowledge across community boundaries influences the development of educational networks that connect different regions and populations. The knowledge-sharing practices you established help create intellectual communities that transcend political and geographical boundaries. As the centuries pass and the medieval period gives way to more modern times, the fundamental principles you embodied, practical problem solving, community cooperation, adaptation to environmental conditions, and systematic knowledge development continue to influence human development in ways that are often unrecognized but always essential. Your life represents a path through history that emphasizes construction over destruction, cooperation over conquest, and adaptation over domination. While this path may be less dramatic than the military adventures that dominate historical narratives, it's ultimately more important for understanding how human societies actually develop and survive. The agricultural innovations, community organizing techniques, and social institutions you help create become part of the foundation for everything that follows in human development. Your recognition that survival and prosperity depend on working with natural and social systems rather than trying to dominate them becomes a fundamental principle for sustainable human development. Your approach to balancing individual achievement with collective responsibility becomes a model for social organization that enables both personal fulfillment and community prosperity. The institutions you helped create provide frameworks for human cooperation that make possible the development of increasingly complex and sophisticated societies. Your emphasis on practical knowledge, systematic observation, and continuous learning becomes a foundation for scientific and technological development that eventually transforms human civilization. The intellectual traditions you helped establish influence the development of educational and research institutions that continue to advance human knowledge and capability. Your recognition that human communities must adapt to environmental conditions rather than simply trying to overcome them becomes increasingly relevant as modern societies face environmental challenges that require fundamental changes in human behavior and social organization. The balance you achieved between individual freedom and community responsibility becomes a model for political development that influences the evolution of democratic institutions and human rights concepts. Your understanding that successful societies must provide opportunities for individual achievement while maintaining collective cooperation continues to influence political and social policy development. Your life demonstrates that historical significance doesn't depend on dramatic individual achievements, but on contributions to the ongoing development of human civilization. The agricultural techniques, community organizing principles, and social institutions you help create continue to influence human development long after the military conquests and political achievements of your era have become historical curiosities. In the end, your legacy represents something that's both more modest and more profound than legendary heroism. The patient, practical work of building human communities that can survive and prosper under challenging conditions. This work doesn't generate epic stories or heroic legends, but it makes possible everything else that humans achieve. Your life as a Viking farmer, trader, and settler represents one of the countless individual stories that together create the larger narrative of human development. While your individual achievements may not be remembered in popular history, they're part of the foundation that makes all subsequent human achievement possible. The agricultural manual you wrote eventually becomes lost to history, its practical knowledge absorbed into the general body of agricultural wisdom that guides farming communities throughout Northern Europe. But the principles you establish, systematic observation, careful experimentation, and continuous adaptation, become permanent parts of human knowledge development. The communities you helped establish eventually evolve beyond recognition, but the social institutions and cultural practices you helped create continue to influence human development in ways that are often invisible but always important. Your contributions become part of the accumulated wisdom that enables human societies to function and prosper. Your approach to problem solving, community building, and adaptation to challenging environments becomes part of the cultural heritage that enables subsequent generations to face their own challenges with knowledge, skills, and social institutions that have been tested by centuries of human experience. And so we end tonight's journey through the long, slow, agricultural decades of your Viking existence, where every day was a small victory against the fundamental hostility of nature. Every harvest was a triumph of human persistence over cosmic indifference, and every winter survived was proof that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things through nothing more dramatic than competence, cooperation, and the stubborn refusal to give up when things get difficult. Sleep well, knowing that while your Viking farmer's life may have been filled with mud, manure, and the occasional existential crisis about whether this is really what your ancestors had in mind when they invented agriculture, it was also filled with the quiet satisfaction of building something lasting in a world where permanence was always temporary and survival was never guaranteed. Sweet dreams, and may your own daily struggles with modern inconveniences seem slightly more manageable by comparison to the challenges faced by someone who had to grow their own food, build their own shelter, and create their own entertainment in a world where the most advanced technology was a wooden plough, and the most reliable weather forecast was your grandmother's creaking joints. Rest easy, fellow travellers through the agricultural tedium of history, knowing that somewhere in the foggy reaches of medieval Scandinavia, your hypothetical Viking farmer ancestor is finally getting some well-deserved sleep after another 17-hour day of keeping civilization running one muddy footstep at a time.